Hello and welcome to this session on licensing Windows Server 2019 in an on-premises infrastructure. My name is Louise Ulrich and it's my pleasure to take you through these slides. They support the module with the same name at getlicensingready.com, and if you need reference material, you'll find handouts at that site as well. Now, in this session, we're going to start with the basics of licensing Windows Server in a physical environment, and then we'll move on to licensing virtual machines. We'll then touch on product activation, downgrade rights, and servicing channels, and then finish with a look at Windows Server 2019 essentials. So let's get started with the licensing basics. Here are the two editions of Windows Server 2019 that medium and large businesses will deploy. Standard Edition on the left and Data Center Edition on the right. Let's find out a bit more detail on these editions. And if we compare them, we'll see that the licensing of the two editions is exactly the same. Now, of course, we'll get more detail on the licensing model as we go through this session, but I can tell you at this stage that it's a core-based and CAL licensing model that's used for both editions. So what are some of the differences between the editions? Well, first of all, they offer different virtualization rights. And again, we'll go into detail on this, but broadly speaking, if an organization has a heavily virtualized infrastructure with many virtual machines, then they're going to be choosing Data Center Edition to license that. And finally, there are some additional features available only in the Data Center Edition, and that's things like some advanced storage features and shielded virtual machines. Both standard and Data Center editions of Windows Server 2019 are, as I say, licensed with the core-based and CAL model. So let's get a bit more detail on how the licensing works in a typical client-server network. Now, have a look at my diagram. You can see that we've got some servers in the middle of the screen, which will run Windows Server. We can see the specification of those servers in terms of how many processors and cores they have. Then there are users and devices which will access the services of the server. And you can see that on the left-hand side, there's a group of users who will use multiple devices to access the server. Then on the right-hand side, there are users who will share devices. Finally, there's an external user at the top of the screen. This is a user who doesn't work for the main company. Perhaps he works for a partner or a supplier, but he does need access to the server. So Windows Server will be installed on the servers, and then we need to assign licenses to those physical servers and also to license the users or devices to access the Windows servers. It's the servers that are licensed with a core-based model, and that means that we need to assign licenses to the server based on the number of physical cores. Let's take the server at the right-hand side first. Have a close look. You can see it's got a single processor with 4 cores. Now, the rules for single processor servers are that you count the cores and assign that number of licenses, whilst at the same time making sure that you assign a minimum of 16 licenses to the server. So this server will indeed need 16 licenses. Now, have a look at the servers with more than one processor, starting at the bottom left, where this server has 2 processors, each with 4 cores. Here, the rules are that you count the number of cores in the server and assign that number of licenses to the server while making sure that there are a minimum of 8 core licenses assigned to each processor. So the server we're looking at here would require 8 core licenses per processor for a total again of 16 licenses. And the final server has 4 core processors, so following the same rules, 8 licenses would be assigned to each processor for a total of 32 licenses. The users and devices are licensed with CALs. You may well know that stands for Client Access License. Organizations can choose between user and device CALs, and in this example, we'd probably recommend that the users at the left were licensed with user CALs, since they'll be using multiple devices, and that the users at the right are licensed with device CALs. Now, businesses can mix user and device CALs in this way, but they do need to implement some processes to make sure that they remain compliant and that all users and devices are indeed covered. But what about our external user? Well, we can assign a user or a device CAL to him as well. So all of the users and devices that we see here just need one Windows Server CAL to access any of those 3 Windows servers on the network. Another point to note is that if you have mixed versions of Windows Server, then you need to make sure that the CALs are the same or a higher version of the servers they're accessing. For example, if you had a Windows Server 2016 server, then Windows Server 2019 CALs would be allowed to access that server, but not the other way around. Windows Server 2016 CALs can't access the higher level, the Windows Server 2019 server. Let's have a look now if you've got a large number of external users, because in that case, it's likely to be cheaper, and it's certainly easier to manage, to buy an external connector license rather than individual CALs for users or devices. An external connector license is a single license which is assigned to a server to allow access to that server for external users. You can see here that the top server has the required number of Windows Server 2019 core licenses assigned to it to cover it for Windows Server, and then the external connector license is assigned to. Can you see the server's gone purple to show that the external users are allowed access to that particular server? Now, if you had external users who needed access to all of the servers on our diagram, you would need to buy an external connector license and assign it to each server. As well as the ordinary Windows Server CALs, which allow access to the services of Windows Server, there are some optional special use CALs which license users to access certain services in Windows Server. These are RDS, or Remote Desktop Services, and AD-RMS, or Active Directory Rights Management Services. Now, you can see that they've appeared on the screen with a tick to indicate that there are no more licensing requirements to use these services from a server perspective. You just turn the services on in the server product. However, if the users need to make use of these services, then they do need to be licensed. So what do these services do? Well, RDS is widely used to allow organizations to run applications on a server for users to access from their desktops, for example. That's great for the IT department to manage and control the applications, and it's popular because of that. RMS is about protecting content. So as an example, one user may want to send another an email, but doesn't want that recipient to forward it outside of the organization. Rights Management Services allows the sender to add some rights management to the email so that it can't be forwarded. And how are these services licensed? Well, there are some additional CALs available. And what the organisation does is they purchase them for any users or devices which need to access those particular services. Now, do note, you don't have to license all users and devices as I've shown here. The external user at the top can have CALs assigned to him, or, as we saw before, it may be easier and cheaper to assign external connector licenses to a server. And you can see here that there are actually 3 external connector licenses available. That's one for Windows Server based functionality, and then one for RDS and one for RMS. You don't need to buy both of the additional external connectors, you just buy what you need. Let's now turn our attention to how Windows Server is licensed in a virtualized environment. Here we see a physical server with 2 10-core processors, and the ghostly servers at the back there are 2 virtual machines. We're going to start by looking at the licensing of the Data Center edition of Windows Server. So, what are the rules? Well, if you license the physical server completely, then you can run an unlimited number of virtual machines. So for this physical server, we'd need to assign 20 core licenses to it. That's 10 for each processor. And we could certainly run the 2 virtual machines shown, but actually we're licensed to run as many as we need to. Here we're looking at exactly the same physical server running 2 virtual machines, but now we'll look at how you license it with Windows Server Standard Edition. Here are the rules, and you can see very similar. If you license the physical server completely, then in this case you're allowed to run 2 virtual machines. Again, we'd assign 20 core licenses to the server. But what about when we want to run a further 2 virtual machines? Well, the rules are that you need to license all of the physical cores again to run another 2 virtual machines. So here we'd assign a further 20 core licenses, and now we're licensed to run the 4 virtual machines shown. Adding further licenses to a server to license additional virtual machines is known as stacking the licenses. Many organisations will start their journey to a virtualised infrastructure by virtualising just one or two virtual machines and then building on that. So how does the licensing of Windows Server support moving from a lightly virtualised to a heavily virtualised infrastructure? Well, we've already seen that it's possible to stack Windows Server standard licenses to add capacity as required, and this is great as there's a constant price associated with that method. Alternatively, if an organisation has software assurance, then they're eligible to purchase step-up licenses. And that means that if they have a standard license with software assurance, then they can move to Data Center Edition without having to buy brand new data center licenses. They just pay the difference in price of the two licenses and software assurance. As organisations move to a more heavily virtualised environment, it becomes more attractive to license with the Data Center Edition, of course, since they can run an unlimited number of virtual machines, but also because, perhaps more importantly, they don't need to have processes in place to count the exact number of virtual machines that they have running at any one point in time. So far, we've looked at just one special server when we've been considering virtualization licensing for Windows Server. And in reality, of course, organizations probably have more servers. And so let's turn our attention to the licensing of a server farm. Let's start with one server again, and you can see that it's a server with two 4-core processors. There's a significant number of virtual machines running on this server, so I think we'd all agree if we had to choose an edition of Windows Server to license this physical server, we would choose Data Center Edition. How many licenses would we assign? We need 16, the minimum of 8 for each processor in this server. Let's add another identical server to the server farm here. Now, this server farm is configured so that the virtual machines can move freely between the physical hosts. So what licenses do we need for this server? Can the licenses from the first server move across? In fact, they can't. Well, strictly speaking, they could move every 90 days, but that's unlikely to be often enough to support the requirements of this server farm. So we'd need to assign another 16 data center licenses to this server, and the same would be true if we were to add another server as well. What this does mean now, though, is that as the virtual machines move around the server farm, we know that wherever they end up, the server farm will be compliant since all machines are licensed for unlimited virtualization. From a software asset management or SAM perspective, this is really useful since even if I add another 5 virtual machines to the third server here, everything's still compliant. So one of the key things to take away from this slide is that there's no license mobility with Windows Server. That's the right to move licenses any more frequently than every 90 days, and so each server does have to be licensed appropriately. Having looked at the licensing of Windows Server in both physical and virtual infrastructures, let's check out a few further licensing principles. There are certain products that need to be activated where they're installed, and Windows Server is one of those products. Activation validates the software of the manufacturer and confirms it's genuine. A product key is supplied as part of the activation process, and that ties a particular instance of the software to a particular device. Now, rather than members of an IT department having to manually supply activation codes and manage the activation process, there are, thankfully, some options to make the process simpler. The default process is using KMS, which provides a way to automatically activate the software using a KMS server on an organization's internal network. When Windows Server is installed, the server contacts the KMS server and the license is automatically activated. KMS activations are valid for 180 days, and the server periodically checks in with the KMS server to renew the server's activation. Active Directory-based activation is an evolution of KMS activation, and it means that as long as a server can connect to an organization's Active Directory, then it can be activated. Both of these methods we've talked about here require a connection to an organization's network, and if for some reason that's not possible, then the last method is required, where a key is manually typed in and the server is activated against Microsoft's activation services. This is a one-time activation, so there's no need to reactivate every 180 days as with the previous two methods. The next thing I want to cover with respect to the licensing Windows Server Standard and Data Center editions are the downgrade rights that are available. If you look at this slide, you can see that today we have just 2 editions of Windows Server for medium and large businesses, the ones we've been talking about, Standard and Data Center edition. But in the past, there was an Enterprise edition as well. So how do the downgrade rights for Windows Server work? If an organization were to purchase an edition of Windows Server today, what could they install in its place if they needed to? Well, let's start with the Data Center edition. And there's a straightforward downgrade right that allows organizations to purchase a Windows Server 2019 Data Center edition license today, and then to install any previous version of Windows Server Data Center. So that could be Windows Server 2016, for example. In addition, though, there are down edition rights for Windows Server, and that means that organizations could also install the Enterprise or Standard editions of any version under a Data Center license. And what about Standard Edition? I think we'd expect that you'd be able to install any previous version of Standard Edition. That's indeed the case. What's not so obvious perhaps is that Standard Edition also allows the installation of any previous version of Enterprise Edition as well. The final concept I want to look at in this section is the notion of Windows Server servicing channels. A particular servicing channel of the software controls how often security and quality fixes and feature updates are applied. There are 2 servicing channels for Windows Server. There's the long-term servicing channel and the semi-annual channel. Let's take a look at the long-term servicing channel first. Here you can see that there's a regular cadence, usually monthly, for security and quality fixes, but that feature updates are only available when a new LTSC is released. You can see that this flavour of Windows Server is for customers who want a very stable and steady environment. Since they get 10 years of support, they don't need to make an upgrade quickly. Customers buying Windows Server through any channel can choose the long-term servicing channel installation option. Now, this is very different to the semi-annual channel. There are the same regular updates for security and quality fixes, but the feature updates are made much more regularly, twice a year, in the spring and fall, and each release is supported for 18 months. After that, the customer must install a more recent release. The semi-annual channel is available to customers with active software assurance, as well as those who buy server subscriptions through the Cloud Solution Provider program. And finally, let's turn our attention now to the editions of Windows Server 2019 that a smaller business is likely to choose. You can see I've included the Standard edition of Windows Server that we've already covered, as well as another edition, the Essentials edition. In terms of how these editions are licensed, we already know that Standard edition is licensed with a core-based and CAL model, but the Essentials edition requires only a server license. Let's get a bit more detail on how this all works. So the Essentials edition just requires a server license. However, there are a couple of restrictions associated with this edition. It's limited to run on a server with up to 2 processors, and then up to 25 users or 50 devices may connect to the server with no further licensing requirements. Note that this is a hard limit rather than a recommendation, and so this edition really is aimed at a small business. Virtualization is supported, and the license allows the software to run in a single physical or virtual operating system environment. And in terms of the servicing channel for Windows Server Essentials, it's supported by the long-term servicing channel only. I hope you've enjoyed this session on licensing Windows Server in an on-premises environment. Why not download the handout that supports this video and take the associated exam on the Get Licensing Ready site now. Depending on your specific interests and needs, you may want to work through some of the other modules on the Get Licensing Ready site and achieve some of the certifications available there. In the meantime, though, the very best of luck with this exam.